Prince Harry has resigned from the board of African Parks, a wildlife conservation charity he'd been closely associated with for a decade, and the timing is genuinely notable, coming just days after his move back to the UK was confirmed. But before we get into the timing, it's important to understand what this charity has actually been accused of, because this isn't a minor governance dispute. It's a serious, well-documented human rights story that's been building for years. Let's go through exactly what's confirmed, what the underlying scandal involves, and how people directly affected by it have responded to Harry's departure. Given the seriousness of what we're covering, I'll keep the details factual and sourced rather than sensationalized. If you want more of this kind of grounded coverage, consider subscribing. Let's get into it. Here's what's confirmed about the resignation itself. According to the BBC, The Independent, and multiple other outlets, a spokesperson for Harry confirmed on Monday, August 24th, that he was stepping down from the board of African Parks, an organization he'd served as president for 6 years before joining its board of directors in 2023. His spokesperson stated that Harry remains, in their words, an active and avid supporter of the organization's conservation mission, and specifically said he's proud of his decade with the charity and supports the ongoing strengthening of its board. So this is being framed by Harry's team not as a break from the cause itself, but as a formal step back from a governance role, while conservation efforts continue to have his support. Now let's talk about what African Parks has actually been accused of, because this is the part that gives the resignation its real weight. African Parks manages 23 national parks and protected areas across 13 African countries. In one of those protected areas, Odzala-Kokua National Park in the Republic of Congo, an investigation found that rangers employed and paid by the organization committed serious human rights abuses against the Baka, an indigenous community with ancestral ties to that land. The specific allegations, which African Parks itself has acknowledged, occurred in some incidents, included beatings, torture, and rape carried out by park rangers against Baka men and women. It's worth understanding the broader model African Parks operates under, since it's central to why this particular scandal has generated so much scrutiny. African Parks doesn't simply fund conservation from a distance. It takes on direct management responsibility for the protected areas it oversees, effectively functioning as the operating authority for parks across multiple countries, employing and directing the rangers who patrol them. That direct management role is precisely why the organization, rather than just the individual rangers involved, has faced such sustained pressure to take responsibility. The abuses weren't committed by some loosely affiliated third party. They were committed by personnel the charity itself employed, trained, and paid. African Parks commissioned an investigation into these allegations through Omnia Strategy, a London-based human rights law firm founded by Cherie Blair. That investigation concluded, and in a public statement, African Parks confirmed that human rights abuses had occurred in some incidents, adding that they deeply regret the pain and suffering caused to the victims. However, the organization has not publicly released the full investigation report, even to its own funders, which reportedly include the European Union. That lack of transparency has become its own significant point of criticism, separate from the abuses themselves. Survival International, an indigenous rights organization that's campaigned on this issue for years, has raised additional concerns about how the investigation itself was conducted. According to their reporting, investigators arrived to interview Baka victims in an African Parks vehicle, accompanied by a Congolese government official, which Survival argued could have a chilling effect on victims' willingness to speak openly. The organization also reported that at least 2 Baka individuals who provided information about the abuses were later confronted and questioned by park rangers about their motives for coming forward, and that further violent incidents, including one that reportedly resulted in a Baka woman losing her unborn child after being beaten, occurred even while the investigation was ongoing. These are genuinely serious, credible allegations from an organization with a long track record of documenting indigenous rights issues, and it's worth being clear that they describe a pattern of intimidation continuing even after the abuses were formally acknowledged and an investigation was supposedly underway. That's a particularly damning detail because it suggests the accountability process itself may have been compromised by the very institution meant to be investigated, a concern Survival International has stated directly and repeatedly. African Parks, for its part, has disputed elements of how Survival has characterized the investigation's cooperation, with the organization's own statement noting that it had urged Survival International to share information and felt that cooperation had been lacking. A disagreement over process that has added another layer of dispute on top of the underlying abuse allegations themselves. Quick break. Given how serious this underlying story is, if you want a more detailed, dedicated breakdown specifically of the African parks situation and the broader debate around conservation and indigenous rights in Africa, let me know in the comments, and I'll put that together separately from our usual royal family coverage. So why did it take this long for Harry to actually step down? According to reporting, Survival International had been pressuring him directly for years. Their director, Caroline Pierce, has stated that Survival first raised these abuses with African Park staff a decade ago, well before the recent investigation and public acknowledgement. More recently, in May of this year, Survival International publicly urged Harry to resign after he attended an African Parks fundraiser in Scottsdale, Arizona, with Pierce stating at the time that it was outrageous to see his continued support for the organization despite the abuses committed against the Baka. That's a pretty direct, sustained public pressure campaign that predates his resignation by months, if not years, which makes the actual timing of his departure, right as his UK move was being finalized, worth examining honestly rather than assuming one thing caused the other. It's worth walking through the fuller timeline here because it shows just how long this particular pressure campaign has actually been running. Survival International says it first flagged concerns about ranger conduct to African Park staff roughly a decade ago, long before any of this became a matter of significant public attention. The situation only escalated into wider media coverage after a major investigation, reported in the Mail on Sunday, brought detailed allegations to public light. African Parks then commissioned its own external investigation through Omnia Strategy, which concluded with the organization's public acknowledgement that abuses had occurred. Even after that acknowledgement, Harry continued his board involvement for a further stretch, including that May fundraiser appearance that specifically drew renewed public criticism from Survival International. Only now, several months after that specific public pressure point, has the resignation actually happened. That's a genuinely long runway between the first internal warnings and the eventual resignation, roughly a decade by Survival's own account, which is worth keeping in mind when evaluating how quickly or slowly this situation has actually been addressed. It's genuinely unclear from the available reporting whether Harry's resignation was directly triggered by the relocation announcement, coincidental timing as he generally reorganized his commitments ahead of a major life change, or a delayed response to the sustained pressure from Survival International and others that had been building for months. All three are plausible, and Harry's team hasn't offered a detailed explanation connecting the two events directly, so it's worth resisting the temptation to assume a single, tidy, causal story here. Let's talk about how Survival International actually responded to the resignation, because their reaction is genuinely more nuanced than a simple victory framing. Caroline Pierce welcomed Harry's departure, but was clear that it doesn't erase his decade-long association with the organization, stating plainly that his departure doesn't undo that record, and that African Parks itself must now be held accountable. That's an important distinction. Survival International isn't treating this as a resolved issue, they're treating it as one step in a broader accountability process that they believe still needs to address African parks as an institution, not just Harry's individual role within it. The larger dispute Survival has raised goes beyond Harry entirely, questioning what they describe as a fortress conservation model, where protected areas can restrict indigenous communities' access to lands they've traditionally lived on and used, a debate about conservation philosophy that will continue regardless of Harry's board membership status. That fortress conservation critique is worth unpacking a bit further, because it represents a genuinely significant, ongoing debate within the broader conservation movement, not just a criticism specific to African parks. The core tension is this: protecting wildlife habitats and biodiversity often involves restricting human activity within designated areas. But many of those areas have been inhabited and used by indigenous communities for generations, long before they were formally designated as protected parks. When conservation organizations enforce those restrictions through armed rangers, critics argue it can effectively criminalize indigenous people's traditional ways of life: hunting, gathering, and moving through land they've always considered their own, in the name of protecting that same land from outside threats. African Parks has defended its overall conservation record and stated it's implementing reforms aimed at strengthening safeguards and improving community engagement and access rights specifically around Odzala-Kokua going forward. Though critics like Survival International argue those reforms don't go far enough given the severity of what's already been documented. It's also worth mentioning that this is actually Harry's second exit from an Africa-focused charity within roughly a year and a half. Back in March 2025, Harry resigned as patron of Sentebale, a charity he co-founded nearly 20 years earlier in memory of his mother, Princess Diana, to support young people affected by HIV and AIDS in Lesotho and Botswana. That resignation stemmed from a completely different situation: an internal governance dispute between the charity's trustees and its board chair, Dr. Sophie Chandauka, who alleged she'd faced bullying, harassment, and a cover-up after trying to raise governance concerns, allegations she pursued through the UK's Charity Commission and the High Court. Harry and his co-founder, Prince Seeiso of Lesotho, sided with the trustees in that dispute and resigned in solidarity with them, a resignation Harry reportedly described at the time as leaving him in shock, given his decades-long personal connection to that particular cause. The Sentebale situation is worth understanding in a bit more detail, since it offers a useful contrast to the African Parks resignation. Chandauka publicly alleged that she'd faced a backlash, including bullying and misogyny, after trying to raise concerns about the charity's governance and executive management, and she described her situation as that of a whistleblower being pushed out for speaking up, a characterization the trustees who resigned alongside Harry disputed. The dispute became genuinely public and litigious, with Chandauka reporting the trustees to the UK's Charity Commission and pursuing the matter through London's High Court to try to retain her position. That's a fundamentally different kind of institutional crisis than the African Parks situation, an internal leadership and governance conflict, rather than an external human rights scandal involving people entirely outside the organization's own staff and leadership. Harry's departure from Sentebale was about taking a side in an internal dispute. His departure from African Parks is about stepping back from an organization facing serious allegations about how it treats the very communities it operates alongside. Taken together, two significant charity departures within about 18 months, for entirely different reasons, one tied to serious human rights abuses within a partner organization, the other tied to an internal governance and leadership dispute, does paint a picture of a genuinely turbulent stretch for Harry's charitable involvements specifically, separate from everything else happening in his personal and family life during the same period. Whether that's simply coincidental timing, given how much else has been in flux for him recently, or reflects something more systemic about how he's chosen and managed these institutional relationships over the years, is a fair question, though not one the current reporting definitively answers either way. There's a broader pattern worth considering here about the specific challenges facing high-profile public figures who lend their name and reputation to large, complex institutions they don't personally run day to day. Harry didn't personally employ the Rangers who committed abuses in Odzala-Kokua, and he wasn't involved in Sentebale's internal executive management disputes either. But in both cases, his name and public association became part of the story regardless. Precisely because that visibility and reputational weight is exactly what makes a royal patronage valuable to an organization in the first place. That's the fundamental trade-off built into this kind of charitable involvement. The same prominent name that helps an organization raise funds and attract attention also means that organizations' failures, wherever they originate within it, inevitably become attached to that same name in the public record, whether or not the individual bore any direct responsibility for what went wrong. So, what does this actually mean going forward? For African parks, the pressure from Survival International and other human rights advocates is unlikely to disappear simply because Harry has stepped down. The organization itself and the still unreleased full investigation report remain the central unresolved issues. For Harry, this resignation removes one source of ongoing public criticism just as he's navigating a major life transition back to the UK. Though it's worth being clear that stepping back from a board seat while remaining a stated supporter of the organization's broader mission is a fairly limited, incremental move, rather than a complete break from the cause. And for the Baka community at the center of this story, the actual lived impact of this resignation is likely to be minimal in the near term. The accountability question Survival International has raised is about African parks as an institution, not about any single board member's presence or absence. The most important thing to watch going forward, honestly, has very little to do with Harry at all. It's whether African Parks ever releases the full Omnia Strategy Investigation report, whether the reforms the organization says it's implementing around community engagement and access rights actually materialize in a way independent observers can verify, and whether the pattern of intimidation Survival International has documented actually stops now that the situation has drawn this much sustained international attention. Those outcomes will matter far more to the Baka community's actual well-being than any individual board resignation, however high-profile the person resigning happens to be. That's the real sourced story here, one that's genuinely more serious and more complicated than a simple royal quits charity headline suggests. If there's a significant update, whether that's movement on the still unpublished investigation report, further reporting on conditions in Odzala-Kokua National Park, or additional comment from Harry's team, I'll be covering it here, so make sure you're subscribed for that. And if you missed our earlier breakdown of exactly how and why Harry and Meghan's UK relocation came together, I covered that in full detail in another video. You can check it out by clicking right here.